Hello everybody, welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the Microvision. The Microvision was the first ever handheld video game console. Now, prior to the release of the Microvision in November 1979, there had been numerous video games released on handhelds, but these weren't true video game consoles, as there's simply only one game that you could play, while the Microvision had various interchangeable carts, which allowed it to be considered a true video game console. For years prior, Mattel had released Mattel Auto Race, which is considered the first handheld video game, and there have been other things, part of the Mattel line of sports games, and even Coleco with their electronic quarterback, and Merlin, which was an extreme success. But what sets the Microvision apart was the fact that it had interchangeable cartridges, as a total of 12 games were released for it following its release in 1979. In the November 1979 release, it originally costed $49.99. Adjusting for inflation in the year 2025, that is $221. Now, during its first year of sales, it did gross $15 million, but following that, it didn't have much success after its first year, as due to a variety of things such as lack of games, only 12 are being released, and its very small screen, as it was 16 by 16 pixels. Now, you're wondering how big is that? Well, imagine Mario from the game Super Mario Land on the Game Boy. Now take that Mario sprite and then put him onto the screen of Microvision. He would take up the entire screen. Now if you look at Mario on the Game Boy game, Super Mario Land, he is very, very small. But if you put him on a Microvision screen, he takes up the whole screen. That's how small the screen resolution was. Alongside that, it lacked any kind of support from other game companies, as many game consoles at the time had games from other companies. The popular games like Pac-Man, Breakout, and Space Invaders. Those got ported to a bunch of different game consoles, but there were no games ported to it. There were only original games, and the lack of ported games to it didn't really help at all. Now, it was released during its time period. It was released in the United States of America, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, the West Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and France. Now, 12 games were released over the course of its existence, starting with a series of games upon its release in November of 1979, and seemingly a game released in 1982, following its discontinuation. It's not seen as a North American name, but the general name throughout the various other countries is Super Blockbuster. But it seems that it may not have had a North American release due to lacking a name for here in America. And of course, and there was actually a 13th game called Brigade, which was meant to be released in 1982, but was canceled and never saw the light of day. And now it seems that, like I said, Super Blockbuster was released in 82, even though it had been discontinued in 81. Weird. Anyways, in 1979, a game for a Star Trek game was actually released for it, called Star Trek Phaser Strike, though later copies of it just read simply Phaser Strike. Now, this was the first Star Trek game, as Star Trek games go all the way back to the early half of the 1970s on the computers, but this is the first handheld Star Trek game, and from what it seems the first Star Trek game that made it to the general public, as the previous one from what it seems was really among the general masses. Now, this was created by the Milton Bradley Company, mostly make toys and board games and stuff, but this is considered a big step in video game history, as it was the first video game console on handheld, as you would take out the cartridge and plug in a new cartridge. And of course, this wouldn't really be seen for many, many, many years later, as it was the first of its kind, and for a long time, the only of its kind. It was until several years down the line, in later half of the 1980s, with consoles such as the Game Boy and various others, that would bring back the whole interchangeable cartridges, as there weren't really many like it, besides as throughout the rest of the 70s and most of the 80s, they're typically just single game LCD games. As so it could have been a success, but if it had been for the lack of games, limited hardware, as also it had a bunch of technical difficulties alongside that. Yeah, even in its first year, a lot, I mean a lot, of the consoles got returned because of the fact that they had technical problems and were faulty. As even nowadays, that's still a big problem who try and collect these, that the problems were just basically just ruined and make it unplayable. You can't play it due to various technical issues that stem back to when they were first made in the 70s. A lot of people return it, and even now, you might high chance might find one that just doesn't work because of this, or at least is damaged in some way. And this probably also hindered its success. But maybe also the lack of games. But this is an important milestone in gaming history. First V-game handheld gaming console, and at least notable one for the longest at times, at least until the Game Boy released. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got to say for today's episode. I'll see you around. See you tomorrow. Bye. Have a nice time.